Yeah, let's just start out. Give us a few words about yourself, Arturo. I'm excited that my readers get to know who you are.
Well, I'm an independent journalist. Call myself a decolonized journalist. I focus a lot on, the intersection of politics and race, a lot of social issues, policing, mass incarceration, immigration is a huge focus of mine. Come from an immigrant family. Kind of fell into journalism a little bit by accident. I used to be a government contractor, and I did a lot of work for Homeland Security through FEMA, a lot of disaster recovery work, stuff like that. But I had a stroke in 2014 when I was 40.
Ah,
Um, but I still can't quite figure out what exactly caused it. But I found myself having to do like a shift in career and, medical bills, all that. We lost everything. It was a bit of a struggle. And I started taking journalism classes because I was already writing on the internet, mostly, just opinion stuff like blogging type stuff. And I wanted to learn more about journalism. So I started getting into it, taking a lot of free courses through like OpenCourseWare, from Harvard and Yale, and then there's the Poynter Institute, and a lot of other places where you could take free journalism courses that are actually very informative. And for the last 10 years, man, I've just been doing this, just been hammering away, getting into investigative work over the last 4 years and doing a lot of that stuff for Unicorn Riot. Um, Done some pretty big stuff over there. So yeah, I mean that's kind of where I'm at. I like to, like I said, I like to focus on stuff that really impacts my family directly. I have my family's mostly black, mostly Afro-Cuban, but my stepdad for the last 30 years is a Jamaican. My stepmom, Afro-Colombian lady for like the last 40 something years. We're pretty diverse family. I raised a trans kid, raised a gay kid, raised a straight kid who has, gave me two grandkids. So, um, that we deal with a lot, especially here in
yeah,
Texas. And it's sometimes it's hard to focus on certain things. Um, and like right now for me, I think the biggest thing has been this government overreach, using immigration as like a disguise to kind of blur the lines between separation of powers between the federal government and then local and state government in
yeah,
a law enforcement capacity. Yeah, it's weird. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. That's who I am. It's kind of what I like to do.
yeah.
Big family guy. Love dogs, that kind of stuff.
Oh, I really appreciate your work. And gosh, I guess I've known you. It's been 4 or 5 years just from I've known you through your work on Medium mainly, and now here on Substack. And I really appreciate you. And I was telling Zuri Stevens about this too. Since the last election, I'm just making this bigger effort to reach out to all these writers I've known, and I'm just finding, and then a lot of it's just my anxiety of what's going on, just strengthening all these connections, and then I'm finding that mutually we can combine our platforms. So I'm excited that my readers get to know who you are, because especially now with all this misinformation in the media, your page, and it's called Decolonized Journalism, is your newsletter.
Yeah.
That's a place I know I can go and get an assessment, a rational and informed assessment about what's really going on. So I really appreciate it. And it helps mellow me out and like realize, okay, there's good people at work figuring out what we're
Right.
up against.
Right. I catch my share of flack from like, ICE, for example, took me off of all their mailing lists. Um, won't give me a reason why. I can still access their stuff. It's publicly available, like the press releases are all on their website, but I don't get the emails anymore. And I've always been, I do focus on ICE a lot. Um, but overall, it's the Department of Homeland Security is kind of, this massive arm of the government, executive level, you know, branch of law enforcement that I don't know, it's just weaponized in so many different ways. Don't get me wrong, there's like a
Yeah.
lot of things that Homeland Security investigation, they do a lot of good and like, busting child trafficking and, stuff like that. But there's this weird culture, and it's in law enforcement in general. where it's this us versus them mentality. And I think it's really harmful. It does more harm than good because the people that we normally rely on to enforce the law are currently operating, on the outer edges of, legality. And who do you
Yeah.
trust at that point? Who do you
Yep.
trust?
And this whole concept of due process, and it's really frustrating to see how the media kind of has just been brushing it over. And it's just an important time to have these important conversations about due process. And it's like all you're doing and all I'm doing, we're just asking for accountability. Explain the choices you're making. If you need to do this, tell us why you need to do this. But we're getting into that authoritarian type of reaction where they're just like, well, we're trying to save the country. How dare you? And it's like, well, we're trying to save the country too. Both of us want to have the best interests of the country at heart, and we just want to hear. And it's like, if we're hiding things, that's where I start to get that kind of twitchy feeling, like something isn't right. And they don't
Right.
want. And I mean, and then there's just ridiculous stuff if they're like taking you off the list, but that's information you can get anyway. That just sort of, just is sort of petty. And
That
it's
is
like that's another example. It's
right.
like they'll say it to us. They'll say, if you don't ask questions, what do you have to hide? So why shouldn't we then turn around and say, if you don't have anything to hide, why won't you ask questions?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's just so many things that they're, again, and this is intentional. The Trump administration is like moving fast, doing all kinds of things. Like just today, like an hour or two ago, Homeland Security announced that they're revoking or they're ending the temporary protected status for Afghan refugees.
Yeah.
And their argument is, and this blew me away, that the situation is so much improved in Afghanistan that it's no longer a threat to these people's personal safety. And I'm thinking to myself, the people's personal safety you talk about are people that help our troops against the Taliban, right? And you're going to send them back into the meat grinder. You know what I'm saying? By saying, "Oh, the economy's better,"
Yeah.
and it's not. So yeah, I'm not even sure that they can just revoke TPS like that. It's in the Federal Register. They did their public notice. That's as far as it's gone so far. But it's just they're asking the Supreme Court to revoke the temporary protected status of like 500,000 migrants under the Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua thing, and it's just insane how fast they're moving. And honestly, I'm surprised to see how much civil liberties organizations and immigrant rights groups and all the ACLUs and all that stuff are really winning in court quite a bit.
Yeah.
Um, and the pushback has been a lot bigger than what I was. My initial reaction was just no way the legal system is going to be able to keep up with Trump. And so far, it seems like it has to a certain degree. And I think we're starting to see a frustration with judges coming from judges with the administration, and that's a good thing because they're questioning the administration's motivations and a lot of other things. So all that stuff is slowly but surely coming to light. I wish the legal system worked faster, but it's what we have, right? So
Yeah. Well, there was that concerning story a couple weeks ago with the was judge in Wisconsin who then got detained. But it's like I've been telling people, it's like, yeah, and that's a sign of the frustration with the administration. But it also frustrates me that the media is not they're not really engaging this correctly. They'll happily report that the administration is frustrated with judges, but then they won't just turn around and say, well, maybe if you stop doing illegal things, you won't have problems with judges. And we
right,
that's just never out there. And so they allow this administration to kind of manage things where and I think the population isn't having it right now because there's that other aspect of what the American people are going to do. And you can't hide that egg prices are now like a buck an egg. You can't hide that. And the lies don't make that go away. So I think we're seeing that the American public is less willing to go along with the misinformation that's being put out by the administration and being, allowed by the media, which should be helping us, the mainstream media, not the uh, journalists like you who are doing the important work. But yeah, it's like, and like the line of the defense of the judges, I've been encouraged by that. The other good news was the decision in North Carolina where the Republican who had been trying to get all the votes discredited, he finally conceded, and so then it's the end of that. But that Supreme Court justice hasn't been allowed to sit since, November of 2024, which is kind of ridiculous. But yeah, the judges are a line of defense, hopefully, but we still have a lot to do. Those of us who are involved with manipulating or massaging the narrative to just ensure that the other side of the story is represented. We have to do that because if they win the hearts of the American people, then we're really out of luck.
Right. Yeah. And I appreciate a lot of what you do, especially like calling out the cultures in like rural America and stuff like that, because a lot of what you describe, and you're so far away from us here in Texas, but the similarities are there. We have a lot of family in very deeply rural East Texas, my wife's side of the family. And man, to say East Texas is essentially clan country is being nice about it. A lot of like my wife's families for the most part are pretty cool. You have your occasional, you know, but you go to places like Longview that's still for the most part a segregated city divided by railroad tracks. Um, Parts of Lufkin, Texas are like that, Nacogdoches. There's so many places. And then you go a little further south and on the east and southeast Texas, and you're talking about Vidor, which is well known, deep, deep clan country. It's one of those towns, it's a sundown town,
Uh,
and it's one of those towns that most people, like in Texas, black people and Latinos in Texas pretty much know to just skip by it. Don't include that as a stop. Make sure you have your gas so you can get it afterwards or something like that. But yeah, you just don't stop there. It's right off of I-10 in between Houston and New Orleans and Louisiana. So yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff. And I see what you say, a lot of the commentary and a lot of it. So there's this story, and this one gets me every time. This friend of the family, we were in Longview, and he's telling this story about he was pulling this big RV type of trailer gooseneck, and he somehow slid off the road and ended up in a ditch, right? And he's telling this story that all these people just kept driving by, and he was surprised. He's like, "Wouldn't you know it? The only person who stopped to help us was a black man, old country boy." And he was like, like it's some big deal that a black guy stopped. And I stopped him right and I changed the narrative right then and there. And I'm like, yeah, but how many white people drove right by you and didn't even bother to help? And then the only black man who came along actually pulled over to help you. What does that tell you, dude? Like, come on. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'm like, obviously you didn't. You thought this old country black guy, scooter and a big dually truck, pulled you out of the ditch, and you're surprised that it was a black man and not a white man. I'm like, but dude, how many white people drove by you? Like, how can you say something like that? So yeah, it's you see that kind of stuff, and it's just ignorance, and not to say they're stupid. It's just a lot of them just don't really know any better, and it's a thing that's just passed down generation to generation, and it's just normal.
yep.
And they don't like being called out, and that drives a lot of woke this, woke that. Like, no, dude, you're just racist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, come on.
It's
So yeah,
interesting. I have a lot of. Oh, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say that it's the same pretty much everywhere in rural America like that.
And I've been trying to figure that out myself, just having grown up in a rural red district and how that stuff, even though it's not your nature to be racist, there's the pressure to make you that way. And the way it's
Yeah,
presented too is really confusing because it's not direct. You know, it's
right,
it, it's through what we have. Like I always take the example of like exclusion, like our sports. We normalize exclusion by saying you don't get to be on the team because you're not good enough. Where in other parts of the world, they're less like everybody should be allowed to play. And we just have that in our whole. And I would say to people too, it's like we teach American exceptionalism. And it's like, what's a synonym for exceptional? Supreme. Why don't we call it, we teach American supremacy?
right,
It's there, it's right in front of us. And it's like, that's fused with our cultural ideology and it's so normalized. It's distressing to hear you talk about everybody knows this area is clan country. Everybody knows where the sundown towns are. But then we know it, we adapt our reaction to our life. We don't go to those towns,
right,
but we don't take the next step where we say people have to know about this and this has to be stopped. I've always been frustrated with the Democratic Party where they're just like, all we have to do is win the swing states and we win the presidency, and it's like they don't even make inroads into these deep red areas. And it's sort of like the
Right.
people that are growing up in those areas, they just have to fend for themselves. And so that's you can't win without the Senate. You can't do anything without the Senate and the House either.
Right, right. And that's another thing, that's frustrating with Democrat politics is um economic populism wins in Texas. It really does. If you look at our state house, you look at our representation in Congress, we've got our Al Greens, we have our George Casars. These are really progressive, individuals and they win regularly. Um and it's not just isolated to cities. And in some areas along the border, progressives did well for a while, up until the last, recent elections where immigration was made a big deal out of. And mostly, uh, the people voting for Trump in those border communities are typically the people furthest away from the border, because most of the people who live along the border are accustomed to, migrants coming across. With the churches, there's the nonprofits, there's infrastructure already in place there, whether it's government funded or privately funded. Most of it's privately through like Catholic Church and stuff like that. Um, but they're used to the migrants coming through and then going to where they were headed. And they understand that the legalities of what's going on and all that better than the rest of the country. But the further you get away from the border, that's where a lot of the you see the swing happen. Um, because people along the border don't want the border closed, right? There's a lot of communities that um, interact with their counterparts on the other side of the Mexican border, and there's a lot of traffic going back and forth. You have teachers from the U.S. who work in Mexico, teachers in Mexico who work in the U.S. And they travel every day to go to work, and you can't shut that down. You can't just end that. There are businesses that work on both sides. So a lot of people along the border understand that, and they were afraid that with Trump and all this sealing the border business, that that's what was going to happen, and it hasn't happened yet. But the more you really think about how they've deployed the U.S. military on U.S. soil, took over public land, and declared it a military installation along the border, I think that's something else a lot of people aren't discussing. Is that you know everybody made a big deal about Greg Abbott taking control over the Eagle Pass area, right? The park there, shut it down. Or Texas state troopers and the National Guard took it over, but nobody's making a big deal about the military taking over this stretch of land and the fact that we deployed, a striker brigade down there, 4,500 soldiers, and this is a rapid reaction force, that could really take off. They can deploy anywhere in the world in like 96 hours. If they're right there ready to go, they could probably deploy in 24, 48 hours. So it's kind of creepy to think about the levels that we're headed. Um, but again, to go back to like the Democrats, I think we're not focusing on that kind of stuff enough. You know, um, Progressive policy politics wins in Texas. That's not a big deal. Nobody trusts the establishment Democrats because of the whole billionaire thing, right? You have billionaire on both sides deal, the private prison industry benefits from either party, so you have a lot of that kind of stuff. And you have to really stand out in Texas to make a difference. And that's what makes Ted Cruz stands out because he's just so extreme with the trans stuff. And so, yeah, I think
Mhm.
there's a lack of focus on a lot of things for the Democratic Party. And I think from a Texas perspective, what you said, not trying to get into some of these places like Biter, um, or East Texas in general, and not focusing enough on this government overreach stuff. I think there's a lot there, and I know somebody said recently that the Democrats shouldn't take the Abrego Garcia bait, and I thought, that's really hurting Trump right now, the whole due
Yeah.
process thing. I'm like, that's what you should go after, So I don't know what Democrats are doing right now.
Yeah, well, I think you're always safe, and I've been telling people, "Don't call it a protest, call it a celebration of the Constitution demonstration," you know? And if we frame all of our
Yeah.
arguments people that are afraid and I think fear is reasonable, because it's scary times. But as long as
Right,
we're
right.
talking, yeah, but as long as we're talking, it's like, well, this is what the Constitution says, and I'm interpreting from. As long as you keep invoking that it's going right to the Constitution. So yeah, like the due process issue, it's dangerous when you start thinking they've normalized that they can just deputize anybody they want. Those people don't have to even show their faces. They don't have to show any kind of identification. They can just pull up in a van and grab you off the street now, and all that's normalized, and nobody's pushing back on that. It's like, well, what about my kids? And anybody could grab anybody is the way it is, right? I've been talking to lawyers about this. It's like, what do you do? And they're like, and that was Will Fullwood, and he was just like, well, you can't resist the police. And it's like, but if they don't identify as police, if they just show up in a van, they got a Punisher mask on, they say, get in the van. How do you know you're dealing with a government agent? It just feels like you're getting kidnapped. And without due process, that's what's happening.
Yeah, some of my readers have mentioned that it's only a matter of time before these masked, unlabeled guys kick a door down and somebody shoots them, like,
Yeah.
and then it made me think of Castle Doctrine in Texas. Like, dude, you come in unannounced, kicking a door down somebody. I mean, this is Texas. That's you just don't do that here. So, it's crazy, and it keeps bringing me back to that report I did last October about the ICE and Homeland Security Investigation Citizens Academy, where they had been training civilians since 2014 how to do immigration raids, how to spot a potential illegal alien in your neighborhood, in your community. And, it hasn't reached the level to where ICE is like, hey, let's recruit these people we trained, but it does feel like they already have a pool to draw from if they need bodies on the street. And I know a lot of people are like looking at these guys, they're frumpy, baggy jeans, crappy shoes, and a t-shirt. And they're like, these guys aren't ICE. And look, I've seen ICE in neighborhoods, like we know when the dude doesn't belong here, but that's how they dress. That they ICE doesn't have uniforms. They want their agents to look as much a part of like just a regular schmo guy walking down the street, and it isn't until they want to kick a door down that they come with the vests. Otherwise, they're just kind of walking around trying to be regular dude, and spy on people. And like you can spot them a mile away. So like when you see a lot of these neighborhoods coming out to protest ICE, it's it's not always that they were informed ahead of time. It's always that they saw the people in their neighborhood ahead of time. And like, that's a narc, that's an undercover, probably ICE, so they start telling people. And understandably so. Like, I mean, that's how it's always been when you have undercover cops in your neighborhood. People are like, hey, undercover cop, all about, you know what I mean? It's nothing new in this country. So yeah, it's weird because they do dress kind of like scrubs a little bit. And then now you have DEA and ATF and US Marshals all working with ICE, and they're using the same tactics ICE uses. And ICE, again, operates on the fringes of the law. And like that kind of culture is now getting passed around to different agencies. And that's kind of scary to think about too.
And I've been asking people too, because you get into these issues of jurisdiction, and these would be other good, completely
Yeah.
reasonable questions to ask people like the press secretary. It's like I understood that ICE only had authority within 100 miles of the border or a point of entry, right? So, so if they're not, is that true, or am I wrong on
That,
that? I'd
that's
worry.
customs. That's Customs and Border Patrol.
Not ICE
ICE,
though. Okay.
no, ICE has a unit, the ERO unit, which is the enforcement. Uh, can't remember. Anyway, they're the ones who pick up people with the administrative warrants. They have anywhere. They can go anywhere.
Okay.
But they technically they can't go after somebody until the process in court or whatever. But they have this little loophole where they could just go get a supervisor to issue an administrative warrant and use that to
Yeah.
justify trying to kick somebody's door down, but it's not really a warrant. And most
Okay.
people know that. That's what frustrates us. But yeah, no, ICE can operate pretty much anywhere.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I was conflating that with border patrol. I think I just had
Yeah.
my words wrong. But it's important to have these conversations. I think it should be part of our schooling, honestly. We should, and it's like because you don't have the rights if you don't know what those rights are.
Right.
And then if we don't have due process, if our police agencies didn't go through the appropriate, methods that they're supposed to take, we'll never know that, and they won't hold them to accountability that way. So due process is there to protect us from our own government, and somehow that's been lost in the wash by what's going on in our society today too.
Yeah. I mean, it started coming back up when Miller mentioned something about suspending habeas corpus and all that stuff. And, you know, uh, it's not, I don't see any justification for that legally or otherwise.
Yeah.
Um, he said something about, we can lift it if the country's under an invasion, whatever. It's not, we're not being invaded. There's not an armed force threatening us. That was never the case. So, invasion was a term that was just used to get clicks, right? Make people angry. And then, now they're equating that fantasy with reality to try to justify harsher immigration policy.
Well,
And
part of that, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
it's the more, it's almost like the more we push back, the harder they want to keep going.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not so sure that that's going to be a successful strategy,
Well, that's one of the places I get frustrated with the media because you get members of this administration start using words like invasion so they can invoke obscure laws that have been on the
Right,
books since the Civil War. It's like now and then they're like, because it's an invasion, now it's a wartime, even though they didn't go through the actual legal definition of what that term invasion is. But they get the public to believe it because they've said it so many times. Because I push back on people when they say immigration crisis. I'm like, there is no immigration
well,
crisis. That's a lie. But it's really hard to even make inroads there because people are so convinced because all they hear in the media is immigration crisis over and over again. But you have to derail because, and I find this a lot, deceitful arguments are always stacked on top of each other. So they'll start with immigration crisis and then they'll make another deceitful statement and they expect you to engage with the second one. And a lot of times we will, but we do have to make that extra effort to go back and say, wait, stop. It's like immigration it's complete. It's like if we removed every immigrant in the country, you wouldn't see an appreciable decline in crime rate in this country.
right,
It's like so the reality of those numbers are never discussed. And then we never talk about immigrants in terms of like my wife, she's an ELL teacher and she helps, children who are refugees from war-torn regions. These kids that are traumatized, they have post-traumatic stress syndrome. We never talk about them. How do they feel when they go out in public and somebody starts screaming at them about how they should be speaking English when this kid is coming from a place where their parents were all killed and they had to witness it? And then we try to think of ourselves as like a compassionate society. And it frustrates me that's not in the news more. That narrative.
right. Like that brings up a lot of issues, especially when you talk about refugees, right? You know, a lot of the people come here are coming here because of us, like stuff we
Yes.
did. From the Afghans to everybody in Latin America to you name it, right? Um, but when it comes to the media, it's weird because first, they start calling it a migrant crisis. Here's some examples that really irk me. They call it a migrant crisis, and then they got flamed for calling it a migrant crisis, so they switched and they called it a humanitarian crisis. Okay, fine, that's a little better, but you're still calling it a crisis, right? And that's part of what creates the problem. The other one is, they kept calling them illegal immigrants, and then they switched to undocumented. Well, undocumented still implies illegal, and that's where conservatives can equate anybody who's undocumented with being illegal because in their mind they think that just crossing the border is illegal. It's not if you're claiming asylum, right? If I cross the border and turn myself into Customs and Border Patrol agent and say I want to claim asylum, that is legal. If I run from him when I see him instead of turning myself in, then I've committed a crime. Asylum claims you have a year after crossing the border to claim them. So if you cross the border, for example, and you don't find an agent anywhere or anywhere to turn yourself in, you're just supposed to go where you're going to go, and then you have a year to claim asylum, as long as you don't see them and run away. Um, so they take the idea that an undocumented immigrant is automatically an illegal. Well, technically anybody who's here on a visa, right, would be undocumented. So that's not fair to anybody.
Hmm.
The proper term to me would be non-citizen, non-citizen versus citizen, because it also helps with the Constitution when you talk about persons and citizens, right? So the
Hmm.
non-citizen is the person's part of the Constitution, and citizens is the citizen's part. And that would help clarify a lot, especially for conservatives. But they're so deep into this undocumented automatically means illegal. They have this weird idea that 20 million immigrants got in under Biden undetected or some weird number
Yeah.
when, the immigrant population has gone up, but it's in the last 8 years, it's only gone up by like 2 million, so there's not 20 million people that can get in. There's not 50 million, what I mean? They have these weird numbers when they just keep getting bigger and bigger every like week, it seems like.
And then I've noticed you posting a lot. All the border busts, it's always the U.S. citizens bringing the drugs in
Yeah.
from over the border, not immigrants.
Yeah. I get those emails every day from Customs and Border Patrol. And every day there are US citizens on there with like hundreds of pounds of meth, That the one that really got me was the white lady who had her teenage granddaughter with her. I was like, guys, you guys are worried about immigrants. Here's this lady who had her granddaughter and 70 pounds of meth in her car. Are you
Yeah.
kidding me? So
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's the kind of stuff that really happens at the border and you never ever hear about it.
Yep.
Migrants aren't bringing drugs on their backs and then turning themselves into Customs and Border Patrol to say, I want to claim asylum. That's not, 90 something percent of migrants across the border do that. That's not how drugs are getting in. You ask former Border Patrol agents like Jen Budd talks about this all the time that Customs and Border Patrol only inspects like 3.5% of containers coming in to ports mainly because of fears of disrupting the supply chain. If they checked them all, it would take forever and it would
Yeah.
disrupt the supply chain. And that's where most of your drugs get in because there's a high probability of getting it. They're coming in containers. So yeah, it's weird. It's the whole narrative about everything is
Yeah.
just skewed in the public, especially when it comes to immigration, and
Yep.
it's being weaponized in such odd ways.
And that's what really frustrates me about our media because it's this manipulation of the narrative through omission, right? When they say,
Right,
"Oh,
right,
100 pounds of fentanyl seized at the border," and then just you're connecting the dots, and it needs to say brought in by a U.S. citizen because if they don't specifically state that, everybody in this country has been indoctrinated to believe it's the immigrants, and that's where our battle is, and you see that kind of thing all over the place when they say, he was in the company of an underage woman instead of he was in the company of a child, you know. Eh,
right,
it's
right.
all that stuff, and it's just there's example after example, but that kind of gets back to what you were saying before and what we were saying about sundown towns. We know this stuff is out there, and those of us who think that, and I know that every now and then I catch them, but there's probably hundreds of others that pass right through me that I don't even notice that are areas of
Right.
injustice. So most of what I try to do in my writing is just kind of peel back the layers and see other places I'm being deceived.
Yeah, I'm real analytical with news these days. And, I catch stuff like, when CBS Nightly News or whatever did a segment on, migrants coming across the border. They're talking to people in New York, and all these people are saying they're letting them in without vetting them, without medical screenings, without this and that. They're military age men, whatever. And they didn't rebuke any of that. They let it go like it was, fact. And I called it out because it's hugely problematic to not say, by the way, none of these things are true. They do this process. They have to be vetted. Their credible fear claims have to be vetted. It's a pretty extensive process. And the fact that it happens for most migrants seeking asylum within 3 days is actually pretty freaking efficient. And people don't understand that. So if a migrant goes through the asylum process, has the credible fear claim assessed, and it's provable enough to allow them into the country awaiting a court date for a full hearing, then they're here legally, right? They're technically documented migrants. They're in the system, awaiting a court date. So again, that undocumented stuff is a misnomer, and it automatically has the conservatives assuming that undocumented means illegal, and the media doesn't fix that. You know, it's just it's weird to me how little things like you said by omission, you know, when another case that really irked me was when a judge ordered Greg Abbott to move the buoy barrier closer to the shore to make way for Customs and Border Patrol boats. Every headline everywhere said judge orders buoy barrier removed. And they tried to portray it as Greg Abbott is, you know, defying the Supreme Court, this, that, and the other. And it was like, no, he told them to move it to make room for the boats. And Greg Abbott did that before he went to court. He knew the judge was going to say, make way for Border Patrol boats. You can't block the federal government. And he moved it closer to shore. Nowhere did he say, take it out of the water. Nowhere did he say, remove it. And they started building this narrative of Greg Abbott is defying the Supreme Court. And the minute I started saying, no, he's not, because they never said, automatically I'm MAGA. I'm defending Greg Abbott. And it's like, no, dude, look, can we just get the truth
Yeah.
out there? Because they're driving this false narrative that's going to be pretty divisive later on. It's gonna be a wedge issue. And you just don't, there was no clarification. There was no, I think one article at the very end mentioned something about it, a little blurb, but it was never ordered taken out of the water. And it's weird things like that they focus on. But when if you actually focused on actual true stories, like
Yeah.
when Homeland Security deported a Venezuelan mom and dad, accused them of being Nicaragua, sent them to Venezuela but kept their kid. You know, you didn't see the media talk about that. You know, they rather focus on this weird non-story and make it a story when you have something this big where DHS kept a Venezuelan parent's kid and deported both parents. So and you know they did so based on accusations, you know, allegations they made against the parents, but they never had a chance in court to contest it. They were denied that part of due process and lost their kid to Homeland Security. So, you know, that's a pretty big story in my opinion, and people are just ignoring, and the media's ignoring.
What you're
So,
saying,
yeah,
well, everything you just said, that's such a good example why I rely on you because I jump on your page and often, and especially in these trying times, whenever there's some sensationalized news, it just doesn't hit right. And before you, I mean, I'm getting to the point where before I even react to the news, I go verify with like a page like yours. And if you're like, oh, this is what really happened, because it's and people always say, I mean, they try to give the media a free pass by saying, well, that has to be sensational so that they can get views. And they try to say it's in order to sell more papers, which I don't think is the reality because they always sensationalize on the side of like the most harmful argument, know.
right.
They never sensationalize in a way that helps, the humanitarian groups. They always portray us in a bad light. They always try to elevate and normalize these hate groups. And so something just isn't adding up.
Right. You know, when you're talking about elevating hate groups, for example, um, you know, in my opinion, and this is one of the things about decolonized, you know, views is some things don't deserve both sides of the story. See what I'm
Yeah.
saying? So if you're gonna talk to a black man about how racism affects his daily life, I don't need to hear from a Klansman about that.
Yep.
You
Yep.
know what I mean? I don't. So, you know, things that are harmful, you know, don't need to be, that would be like saying we shouldn't demonize Hitler because he's not here to defend himself.
Yeah.
Are you joking me right now? Like, no, dude, you know, I'm not. I had a friend whose dad was ex-Klansman, and I learned a lot from this guy over about 6 years. And there are certain things that just don't deserve air. They don't deserve the space or the time. Instead of trying to hear that Klansman's view, we should be trying to figure out how to end this scourge on our society. Like you know, it's ridiculous to
Yep.
me. You know, I don't need like George Ramos once, real big in the Latino community, was on Telemundo forever. He went and interviewed Klansmen and stuff like that. And he's a white Latino, right? Like I am. And that Klansman made it very damn clear that he didn't care how white George Ramos was, that he would string his ass up if given
Yeah.
the opportunity. Okay, cool. That told a lot of white Latinos a lot about hate in this country. But at the same time, I'm not so sure that that interview was really beneficial. Like
Yeah.
I don't know that I need to hear from that guy in the back. I think it was Arkansas somewhere. Like I don't need to hear from that
Yeah.
guy.
And that's the other thing, because they under the guise of this, oh, we need to hear both sides. They say that, but then our side never gets a chance to speak,
Oh,
right? So we sit here patiently listening to the white supremacists prattle on and on and on, and then they're like, "Oh, we're out of time for the day." So it's like exactly what you're saying. It's that stacking lies on top of each other again. First, they
right,
claim they're for equal opportunity. They never intend to give us equal opportunity, and then they use every platform just to express their hate views.
right, right. Yeah, it's just interesting how that is because when we when we call it out, suddenly we're anti-white, right?
Yeah,
You know, it says something about this country that when you call out racism, you're anti-American and you're instantly a communist. People don't know what the hell communism is these days.
yeah,
I posted something on Substack the other day about how diverse my family is and why these issues matter to me. And some guy saw communist. I'm like, oh no, I'm from a diverse family. I'm a communist all of a sudden. What the heck? So yeah,
yeah.
it's I don't know. The right is a wild place, and for some reason, I've been getting a lot of incel activity lately, and I just those guys are too easy. They
What
talk shit
you're
about
getting people commenting, or what are you
yeah,
getting?
like
I you cut out on
yeah,
again.
no, incels. I'm getting a lot of incel commentary in my replies to my tweets and stuff, and even on Substack. And those guys are just too easy. They talk shit about women all day long, and I tell them simply, look, dude, no woman is gonna fall head over heels for a guy who talks like this. Fucking,
Yeah,
you want success with women, start there. Stop doing that shit. You know what I'm saying? Like Jesus Christ, man. You can't just be sitting there talking shit about women all day and then expect to get laid. Like, what are you doing, dude? So yeah,
yeah. No, that's the case. Well, I found though too, and I think this is another one of their tactics because they'll come on and they'll leave these just awful comments. But on some various platforms like Substack, sometimes you get the reply and you can't tell who the reply is towards. So I think they're a lot of times they're just bots trying to get you to be
yeah,
hostile, so that other readers who would otherwise be good readers will block you because of the things you say. Because there's been times too when I've said to people, I'm like, I read a comment, I'm like, who is that directed at? They're like, "Oh my gosh, it wasn't at you, it was at this jerk." So I think it's another level of this where they don't have anything better to do but to undermine anybody who's trying to be responsible and try to act in favor of a humanitarian cause and just to speak reason.
right.
And I just don't know, like, the amount of funding that's going into these hate groups. I think, I mean, nobody he's tracked down. There's all these old money fortunes that people have been sitting on so long it's just made their blood rot, I guess. And all they want to do is preserve their place at the top of the food chain. So it's like all these crazy podcasts that get just ungodly amounts of money. It's like nobody can really. It's like if you're trying to say a humanitarian message, there's no money for you. If you want to spread hate, seems like it's real easy to get money. That bothers me too.
Yeah, I mean there are a lot. There's the Adelson family, out of Vegas, the casino magnate guy. There's the heiress from Sears. There's a lot of people who are big money who donate to a lot of so-called think tanks that have been labeled hate groups um, through what's called donor advised funds, which is basically dark money. But I've reported on this a few times. Newsweek did expose a bunch of people several years ago, billionaires that are donating to groups that are designated hate groups. And yeah, the money is tremendous. You look at Turning Point USA, and they're mostly funded by the Uline family. And, there, those Uline catalogs, you get it, to buy tape and boxes and all that. That's who that is. And, Charlie Kirk makes 300K a year. That's what he pays himself. And like, at the end of the day, you're listening to a guy who's doing the bidding of billionaires, and he's driving divisive content for a reason. And that's to try to keep everybody angry. Conservatives say this all the time, that hate is just something that billionaires do so we could take our attention off of them. But then here they are supporting it.
Well,
It's crazy, man, crazy.
yeah, it's frustrating, and it bothers me too the extent because the mainstream media, I think you feel an influence there because they give so much credibility to the other side. Like we were saying, they misrepresent things, seeing things like not reporting on these things is if you abduct a person with no due process, then that's human trafficking. That's not a deportation at that point. And all we need to do is if the media would just fairly represent or fairly discuss all these things that are going on right now. But the U.S. public is not in a position to make an informed decision. So I guess that's how we got here.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of this, and everything we're talking about right now, when you think about it, starts to go back to the billionaire class, right? And some of the same people that are funding these Islamophobic and anti-black and, putting money into outlets like Breitbart or Barry Weiss's Free Press, the Breitbart or Substack, that's what I like to call it. Um, you know, damn, I lost my train of thought.
Well,
but
let me
but
just
you,
go ahead.
it's the same. That's what I was saying. It's basically the same billionaires that are funding all of these media outlets. And, you look at the ownership structures of a lot of corporate media and, everything's interconnected. And that's essentially, goes back to the white money and the stock market that was created from the slave trade. And you know what I mean? That's
Yep.
where you start getting into the real meat of the structure of how politics in this country operates. And yeah, it is all interconnected to slavery and all that. So, people don't see a lot of how our foreign policy, domestic policy, and all that stuff gets tied together, but it is. It's all tied together in that same sort of concept.
And I,
It's a
I
long,
did a, go, yeah, I did a little post the other day about how notice the groups that immediately get attacked, like the Black Panthers. They were doing like these breakfast programs, school breakfast programs, and they just get vilified in the media. And then like anti fascism groups, Antifa, they get attacked in the media,
yeah,
and Black Lives Matter gets attacked. All these things get attacked, like all these things that are founded to help people, but then we never talk. And then they go after DEI. They block Black history, even though they're saying we got to talk about both viewpoints. They're kicking all those things out. But then there's no equivalent response to hate groups. There's never the United States doesn't come together and say let's put an end to the Klan once and for all. Every time there's a humanitarian group making waves, that's shut down. We find the resources and the media attacks them. Hate groups, we just don't even talk about it.
yeah, and that's another thing too that I talked about recently because I've been seeing a lot of Jewish scholars calling out the what they call cynical claims of anti-Semitism on college campuses and stuff. And one of them brought up a good point is that you're focused on anti-Semitism on college campuses, but nobody's saying anything about it, about hate groups, about the direct connection and the explosion of anti-Semitism with the explosion of Christian white nationalist groups, hate groups, neo-Nazi groups, things like that. And the problem is they're causing harm because they're equating what's not anti-Semitism with anti-Semitism, and they're ignoring actual anti-Semitism coming from neo-Nazis and stuff that are a very valid threat. College kids don't commit mass shooting, neo-Nazis do, and the focus is completely on the wrong place. And hate groups are roaming around unabated at this point, especially with this administration. They're not saying anything about anti-Semitism within the building, the White House. And I just recently did this report for, again, Unicorn Right, where I went through basically everybody in the administration, looked up all their social medias, all their everything, and find out which ones are Christian white nationalists, which ones are racist, which ones are this. And man, there are dozens.
Yeah.
This is the most anti-Semitic administration easily since Nixon, if not worse than Nixon. Um, so yeah, it's pretty bad in the White House. You know, there's a lot of you have Christian white nationalists at DOD who has a weird obsession with the border. You know, you have Marco Rubio who pushes white nationalist ideas at state. You know, it's a pretty precarious time. Cash Patel, Dan Bongino, and FBI. That's scary shit. You know, Dan Bongino's not all there, in my opinion. I think he's pretty unhinged guy. So yeah, we're in a crazy time for sure.
And
But
it's
hey,
yeah.
man, I think my battery's dying.
Oh, okay. Well, we can start closing down. We're close to an hour anyway. So,
Oh
well,
wow, wow, okay.
yeah. No, it's been wonderful. I really, like I said, it's wonderful to talk to you, and it'd be nice if we could just sit down and have a relaxed conversation. But maybe 3 years from now we'll be able to do that and just talk about our families and good fun times.
Yeah, no kidding, no kidding. But hey, you know, I really appreciate these discussions with people who kind of understand what's going on, who get it. Um, also appreciate, you know, I want to say this earlier, you know, the help and stuff that you gave me a while back with Medium and stuff like that. That was really helpful, and I still, you know, use a lot of what I learned from you then
Good. Good.
now in a lot of writing. So I really appreciate it, man. Thanks, Walter.
Oh, good. Well, I appreciate everything you told me a lot just now in this conversation, and these are the conversations I'm going to go walk the dog, and I'll be thinking about this for 2 hours, and then
Right.
I'm gonna write 6 articles when I come home probably, so, yeah, no, I always enjoy seeing your stuff out there, and, for all the people viewing here, yeah, go give Arturo's page a look. I mean, it's so well informed, and I consider you a real journalist. I'm more like a thought experiment guy where I'm just trying to figure things out, but you're checking things and you got all that access to the feeds, you see the news that's going on, and it just boy, I really appreciate all the work you do, so thank you.
Man, thank you, Walter. I appreciate you having me on. This was awesome. We got to do it again.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
100% of the time, I love it. All right, well,
Awesome.
let's call it good. Somebody says, "Thank you so much, Artua is the best," so I'm glad to see some of your fans are here already.
Awesome. Awesome.
All right, well, you have a good day, go enjoy the sun, and yeah, we'll talk again soon.
All right, bro.
Yep,
Cheers.
bye-bye.